Most of the Genshin community's focus is centered on the characters who either do damage or help others do more damage. While that usually provides the best results against the hardest content, it does make it easy to miss out on a lot of the diversity built into Genshin's combat, and many of the more defensive-minded characters are often overlooked or misunderstood as a result. There are a number of different ways in which support characters can provide defensive utility, and they can make a surprisingly big difference to the combat experience. The specifics of each defensive character's abilities are quite diverse, but can be loosely grouped into 5 categories: classic shields, damage reduction shields, parrying, damage absorption, and interruption resistance. Let's take a look at what each of those means and explore some examples for each section to show how much variety the current roster of characters provides for each one. First, classic shields. These are the most common and are generally what most people think of when thinking about shields in Genshin. They are an impenetrable barrier which can absorb a specific amount of damage, and a character protected by one will take no damage at all from a vast majority of sources. While the shield is active, the character is also immune to being knocked around and can perform their attacks without worrying about being interrupted. Once the shield's HP is depleted, it will disappear, and the remaining damage from the attack which broke it will hit the character. Each character who creates these shields has different scalings for their shield's HP, plus there are external factors like buffs and debuffs which can affect how much damage these shields can absorb. The most significant factor is the shield's element. Each shield is created using one of the 7 elements, and in most cases the shield is 2.5 times more powerful against its own element than it is against other elements. Geo is the exception and is more general purpose. Geo shields gain a 1.5 times bonus against all damage types. Interestingly, there is no benefit to stacking multiple classic shields at the same time. If an enemy attack hits for 1000 damage, each shield will take 1000 hit points worth of damage, regardless of how many are there to protect you. Zhongli is the epitome of a pure classic shielder. His shield is the most important part of his kit, and it's extremely powerful. It has a very high HP pool, plus several mechanics which further boost its strength, and as a result, each time you cast it, it provides great protection for a long time. Zhongli is useful in pretty much any team, but for people who don't rely on shields entirely, he is sometimes held back by his element and his hyper-focus on shielding. An interesting contrast to Zhongli is Poise. His shield is very different. It has a very low HP pool, and it only lasts for a couple of seconds. However, when it breaks or expires, it heals the party and applies Dendro to opponents. And since Poise generates a new shield every couple of seconds, it's not long before another one appears. As a result, his shield is a lot more valuable than it might seem if you just look at the raw strength. Poise is also an incredibly powerful healer through the use of his skill, and as a result he unlocks a ton of viable teams. Another interesting way to obtain classic shields is through the crystallize reaction. When a character applies Geo to an enemy who has an elemental aura, it will consume some of that aura and create a shard. If you pick up that shard, it will grant a classic shield for the next 15 seconds, with its strength determined by the Geo character's character level and elemental mastery. This reaction is often ignored, and is a bit too awkward to rely on in difficult content, but can be a fun playstyle to experiment with, especially when coupled with the 4-piece archaic Petra artifact set. Your preferred playstyle, characters, and your ability to dodge will generally determine how valuable classic shields are to you, as explored in more detail in my recent Zhongli video. But even if you don't rely on them entirely, they're well worth including in your teams. Damage reduction shields, often called pseudo-shields, are provided by a handful of characters. Unlike classic shields, these are not impenetrable, and a character protected by one will still receive damage. However, the damage will be reduced by a certain percentage depending on the shield. These do not have an inherent HP pool and instead reduce damage by a set percentage for a specific period of time. The scalings for this are different per character and can be affected by buffs and debuffs or other factors. In another contrast to classic shields, damage reduction can stack. With enough stacked together, they can even completely nullify incoming damage. Even better, damage reduction affects the damage before it touches any classic shields, so combining these two types of shields together provides a very strong result overall. Xingqiu is the most commonly used character who provides damage reduction. When you use his skill or burst, it creates these things called rain swords, which float around your active character. One of their benefits is that they provide a damage reduction while present. Plus, when they expire, they provide a small amount of healing to the active character. In many teams, this isn't particularly noticeable, but in some, it can actually be strong enough to be relied on as your only defensive utility. Plus, it's a great way to strengthen any classic shields. Beidou provides a similar damage reduction when you use her burst, which quickly gets overshadowed by the addition of a classic shield once you have her C1. The combination of these two makes her shield more powerful than it might seem at first glance. Another source of damage reduction which works a little differently is Jean's C6. Once her final constellation is unlocked, Jean's burst will provide a very strong damage reduction to any character who is within its circle, plus some limited protection once you leave the circle, which is an interesting contrast to everything we've touched so far, since it's not something which moves around with the character. Damage reduction is easy to overlook, but it's well worth considering when building teams. It's often the deciding factor for me when picking between Xingqiu and Yilan. If the team lacks any other defensive utility, then Xingqiu is the logical choice. Next, parrying. Parrying is where things get a little different. To use a character's parry mechanic, the first step is to hold down their elemental skill. This will activate their shield, which absorbs damage for a short period of time. When the skill is released, either by manually letting go of the button, or by waiting until the skill's maximum duration, or through some other detail specific to the character, it unleashes damage on nearby enemies as an extra powerful attack. The most interesting aspect of parrying is that it can reward you if you focus on timing your parry. Exactly how this works is unique to each character, but generally if you tap the skill at the exact right moment when an enemy attack hits your character, it provides a boost. Currently, there are 3 characters who can parry, and each of them has a slightly different take on the idea of a perfect parry. Beidou is the OG parry character, and in her case, it's a fairly simple mechanic which absorbs damage while held and unleashes it when released. If you tap Beidou's skill at the exact moment an enemy attacks, it will instantly charge to its maximum capacity and cause the maximum possible damage to nearby enemies. Yunjin's parry has 3 charge levels, which you normally trigger by holding her skill for a specific amount of time, and has a separate damage multiplier for each level. Tapping the skill at the right moment skips to the highest charge level, again causing the maximum damage. Candace's parry is a little less reliant on skill. It charges up over time but without any specific charge levels, and instead of requiring any manual timing, the moment Candace gets hit by an opponent, she counterattacks. This makes it feel like there's little benefit to timing her skill right, but in practice it's actually fairly similar to Yunjin's approach, and it's just more forgiving version of the same concept. Parrying can be difficult to master in the heat of a battle, but is a very satisfying mechanic which feels very different to the rest of Genshin's combat. It's a perfect example of something which might not really be worth focusing on in the Abyss, for example, but which can add a lot of enjoyment to the less difficult content. When it comes to damage absorption, currently only 1 character in the game has the ability to take damage on behalf of other characters, and that's Dea. While Dea's skill is active, anytime a character within its field takes damage, a portion of that damage is absorbed by Dea instead, spread out over the following 10 seconds. It's unclear to me how valuable this mechanic is. I currently don't have Dea, and a lot of people who do have serious concerns about whether her damage absorption is really that useful. It will be interesting to see whether it becomes more valuable as we get further into Fontaine, with its penchant for providing buffs for characters whose HP rises and falls over time, and whether any characters aside from Dea will provide this utility. Finally, Interruption Resistance refers to your ability to resist being knocked around. All characters and enemies have hidden attribute which we call Poise, which gets drained as attacks hit them. When their Poise runs out, the attack chain is interrupted, they get knocked back, and they're unable to act for a short period of time. Note that in reality, it seems that the game implements Poise backwards, filling the bar when hit rather than draining it, but I find it more intuitive to think about it this way instead. Some types of characters have less poise than others, making them easier to stagger, and very powerful attacks from stronger enemies may be able to stagger any character in one hit. This is why Catalyst and Bow users feel very flimsy. They have the smallest amount of poise. While Classic Shield blocks attacks entirely and prevents any poise damage at all as a result, there are also many characters whose talents provide interruption resistance as a separate benefit. This comes in two main flavors. Many characters gain personal interruption resistance while casting specific talents or while in a specific mode, while a handful of characters provide interruption resistance to the entire party for a period of time. Xingqiu and Dea are good examples of how this is often provided to the team alongside other defensive utilities. Xingqiu's rain swords provide a very good interruption resistance alongside their damage reduction, while Dea's damage absorption field also provides interruption resistance. It's a feature which is easy to miss since it's so subtle, but it's another one of the reasons Xingqiu is so highly valued. Raiden and Cyno have the good and bad of personal resistance limited to a specific mode. Both of these characters have a powerful burst, which switches them to a different state with powerful electro-infused attacks. Raiden's interruption resistance during her burst is greatly increased, and she can shrug off pretty much any attack which hits her, making her feel incredibly powerful and almost unstoppable. In contrast, Cyno's resistance is very weak, to the point where it almost feels like it doesn't increase at all, and he feels a little vulnerable and often gets knocked around during his burst. Personal resistance is even more important when using skill which has a long cast time. The perfect example of this is Nahida. Her skill can take a long time to cast, but while you're casting it, she's pretty much immune to being knocked around, despite still being vulnerable to taking damage. Poise and interruption resistance is generally important against larger enemies, and is particularly valuable for characters like Yoimiya, who have very low poise but benefits a lot from doing their full normal attack sequence without pause. While a classic shield is usually the go-to solution, a strong enough team-wide interruption resistance buff can do the job as well. Genshin has a habit of rewarding DPS above all else in the Abyss, and as a result, any defensive utility tends to stay out of the spotlight, but it can be an essential part of many teams. It can be surprisingly fun to play around with outside of the difficult content, and parrying especially provides much needed variety to the overworld combat, which can often become very underwhelming when you've built your characters for the Abyss. There's a surprising amount of diversity in the defensive utility each character provides, so I'm planning to follow this up with a video comparing and contrasting each one, to make it easier to see what situations might lead you to pick each one over the other. These details can be overwhelming, but can also make team building become an interesting puzzle. Until next time!